The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act are supposed to keep the air we breathe and the water we all drink safe. But factory farms, which produce nearly all the meat consumed in this country, are exempt. The rules don't apply to them. How is that possible? Keep listening and find out the truth and what you can do to protect you and your family and keep them safe. Welcome to Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health. I am Dr. Johnny Lieberman. If you've ever wondered how your everyday choices, including what you eat, what you buy, what you wear, and the medicines you take, impact your health, the health of your family, animals, and the planet, you are in the right place. Let's get to it. Dr. Johnny Lieberman here with Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health. I am very pleased to welcome Daria Bednarczyk on our show. Daria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for letting me be here again. It was so fun the last time.
I'm looking forward to some more fun, some more education. I know I learned a lot from our last session, and I'm hoping we have a lot which will be engaging and share something important for our listeners. Daria, what one thing, one topic you wanted to get across that's the most important for our listening audience that might make a difference in their lives and change something for them? What would it be?
I think the biggest topic that I would like to focus on today is agricultural exceptionalism and what that is. And essentially, what that is, it's the idea that farming and food production are just so important that they deserve special treatment and protections or policies compared to other industries that allow them to slip through the cracks and violate laws that should be holding them accountable for harms that they cause to communities and animals.
Agriculture exceptionalism. That's a new term for me. You touched on it briefly. It certainly seems like food production is very important. Shouldn't those who produce food maybe get some passes on the law and exceptions to make it easier, given how important food production is? Or are there downsides with this agricultural exceptionalism?
Sadly, there's always a downside to this. And yes, I agree that food production is very important. However, with the laws that are currently not being enforced as strongly as they should, particularly the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, I think what we're actually doing by not holding CAFOs accountable for their harm is really damaging the community surrounding CAFOs and the nation as a whole.
So there's definitely downsides. And these exceptions, which I think we're going to talk about, they're pretty exclusive. And maybe you can get into it. There are other sectors of the economy that have an important output that they produce, but many of them are still held accountable, as are businesses held accountable, even if they produce an important product. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's accurate. And that's why it's so concerning that given all of the other industries that have to be held accountable and follow the law, that large ag gets an exemption for. It doesn't really seem fair from the business point of view.
And beyond fair, it can be damaging. There's real world consequences. Can you name one or two examples of perhaps how an exception evolved and then what the real world consequences are for people?
Before we dive into that, I just want to remind everybody we're talking about CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations, which are these huge livestock operations where thousands of animals, whether they be cattle, hogs, chickens, turkeys, what have you, are all living in shared confined spaces. And because of agricultural exceptionalism, these industries get to surpass what other industries have to follow regarding like laws such as the Clean Water Act. The harm that that causes is communities surrounding these farms are often left with toxic substances in their water supply. And this could be really harmful to people living in those areas. And we're not even getting into how this affects air and it can cause asthma in people. There's really a lot of downsides to humans who live near CAFOs because of these cracks that CAFOs are allowed to slip through.
So both of these acts are enforced and administered through the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency. Is that correct?
Correct.
The EPA sets some kind of standard threshold or something similar, a level beyond which it would be illegal to emit a certain chemical or toxin, and below which it would be acceptable based presumably on studies which revealed what are safe or acceptable levels of chemicals or hormones or toxins to be in our air or in our water. Is that a fair layperson's understanding?
Yes, it is absolutely the correct reasoning.
Can you pick one example or one chemical which is put out, which is dangerous at a certain threshold, but the farms are given a pass? And so there's a toxin or a chemical that we're potentially drinking or breathing, which can cause problems?
I think one of the biggest, most surprising facts or statistics about this is when CAFOs apply manure to their fields. When rain comes down and falls onto these fields and all of that runoff goes into the water, all of the nitrates in the runoff can actually trigger what are called algal blooms. And what algal blooms do is they affect the oxygen levels in the water and therefore essentially suffocate fish or any types of organisms living in the water surrounding the CAFO. Now we have this hypoxic waterbed filled with dead fish, and it contaminates the drinking water in that area as well.
So drinking water contaminated as a result of the manure wash off, basically. And is that regulated or is that being watched? Are these CAFOs being held accountable? Or is this something that's happening all the time?
Sadly, this is happening all the time, but the problem with that is that the EPA generally allows CAFOs to decide for themselves whether or not they're discharging pollutants and therefore need a permit. And to put that into perspective, it would be like letting drivers decide if they need a license and if they can get that license and do nothing for obtaining that license. The result of that is that tens of thousands of CAFOs nationwide are being monitored because they're able to slip through those cracks, like has been mentioned. This type of pollution is constantly occurring without holding anybody accountable for it.
So tens of thousands of CAFOs are not being monitored. Is that what you said? I thought it sounded like you said they are being monitored.
No, it's if you're a large CAFO, which is categorized by the number of animals that you are housing, those generally need to have NPDS permits, but it's up to the CAFOs themselves to self-report. We actually don't have a correct or accurate number of how many CAFOs are in the United States because of this self-reporting system.
Wow, self-reporting. I love your example there of driving and permits because it's a similar process. There are certain criteria to get a permit. It can be taken away under certain circumstances. And it gets to what I see as the heart of the matter is this concept of self-regulation. I don't think that most people, most patients who see doctors and seek health care would be comfortable with the idea that doctors and hospitals are going to self-regulate ourselves. We're going to decide if we have the competence to practice medicine as a group. There's not going to be a certifying board or standard that's a test you have to pass or a competence you have to achieve to get your license to practice medicine. As a physician, I think that there needs to be some kind of standard outside of an internal one. And hospitals have the same thing. If you go to a hospital, they can't self regulate. They have governmental and other organizations coming in to certify them on a bunch of criteria, making sure that they're meeting safety standards and standards that are industry practice. They don't get a pass. I don't think you'd want hospitals to get a pass or doctors Or maybe lawyers. Do lawyers practice in a self-regulatory system, or is there some oversight?
There's absolutely oversight. I think that would be
Yeah.
pretty wild if our doctors and lawyers were able to self-regulate.
So I think that most of my listening audience would agree the idea is ludicrous. It's a free for all. How is it possible that something that big or a business so big that has such a profound impact on our day to day life is pretty much left to self regulate?
And that's where it comes back to agricultural exceptionalism, which allows this industry to self-regulate.
Yeah, I find that disturbing as a consumer. This agricultural exceptionalism is just mind blowing. They get a pass. They can pollute the water. We heard about one of the consequences, and there's downstream consequences, no pun intended, for these algal blooms and water pollution. Am I correct? Daria, what else happens aside from the water turning a nasty color and some fish dying off?
I believe we mentioned this in the first episode about CAFOs, but higher nitrate levels can cause blue baby syndrome, which can be fatal to babies. And the scary thing is that with climate change being on the rise and fueling more intense storms, overflows and runoff from these farms are just going to become more frequent, meaning that the pollution is going to happen more often and therefore impact human health on a larger scale.
Nitrates have much more toxicity than the blue baby syndrome. Nitrates also cause cancer. They're listed as carcinogens or cancer causing agents. It's hypothesized that's part of the reason why processed meats have been linked to cancer. Nitrates are used commonly in the processing of meats to make your bacon or your deli ham or your deli turkey or your sausage. There's a direct link between eating those foods and cancer, and nitrates likely have a lot to do with it. The other components of runoff of manure, which is being poorly regulated, is that manure from a cow or a pig, not unlike manure from a human, is loaded with bacteria, which, if ingested, consumed in your drinking water, could lead to major health problems. Some of them you're familiar with: E. coli, Klebsiella, the so-called coliform bacteria, which can cause blood infections in patients, urinary infections, abdominal infections. And then there are some of the other ones which occur in outbreaks more often: Salmonella, Campylobacter, Listeria. They're all linked to animals, and it's in their stool, which, if it's being managed and regulated appropriately, is much, much less of an issue. But as we just heard, that's far from the case. It's being allowed to spill over into our environment, mostly unregulated, and there's real world health consequences for you, your family, and the community and the public in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you said. And I know we mentioned this last time as well, but I'm going to repeat it because I find it to be so important. But unlike human waste, which goes through a multi stage treatment process, the manure found on CAFOs is typically stored in the lagoons we discussed or tanks and then sprayed directly onto fields and oversaturated. And that's where this runoff goes into waters and all the pollution for the drinking water occurs and harms people. So it's really something that should be noted and is of concern.
Have there been any efforts over the past few years to try and hold these facilities accountable for the toxins and the pollution that they produce, to try and just get them to comply with the laws?
Yeah, so efforts have been made, but given how strong and powerful and how much money the ag industry has, every effort has been pushed aside or defeated in some way or another because the ag industry is loud and has a lot of money that they could put into it to block a lot of these efforts. So even though efforts have been attempted, they've all been blocked. And that's why it's really important to note that this isn't just happening to our waters. This is also happening with pollutants that are being released into the air.
So you mentioned asthma before. So let's shift from water to air now. Are there some known air pollutants which are being discharged into the air from these facilities, which are directly causing human harm, which are facilities are escaping regulation?
Some of the main pollutants would contain ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and other fine particles, which are all really harmful and detrimental to human health.
I know ammonia is one that comes to mind. Ammonia is something that's in some of our cleaning products, correct?
Yeah.
So that brings a smell to mind. Ammonia. The glass cleaners are typically the ones that have ammonia in them. I was just cleaning a mirror in my home, poorly ventilated room, and just a few sprays of this chemical cleaner. And that's a pretty strong odor. Ammonia is a lung irritant. If you're cleaning, as anyone who cleans for a living will know, you want to do that in a well ventilated space, not just because it's toxic fumes, but it irritates the lungs. It causes acute health issues if the concentrations of ammonia are too high. So imagine that toxic ammonia as well as methane, which has its own unique smell, if anyone's ever experienced it. I can't comment on hydrogen sulfide, but I think that does as well. These are toxic chemicals that have their own toxic scents that are just going into the air almost unregulated. And they have direct consequences for human health, especially on the people who live near these farms, which are exposed to much higher levels. Does that sound about right, Daria?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as we have been stating throughout today's episode, is the fact that the agricultural industry is able to get away with a lot of this. And you asked me earlier about have there been any efforts to try to make CAFOs comply with these laws? And an example is in 2018, Congress passed what's known as the Farm Act, which at the end of the day, what it boils down to, it exempted certain CAFOs from reporting specific air emissions under federal law. This solidifies the fact that many industrial livestock operations are able to continue to pollute the air with relatively little federal oversight. And that's really scary because no matter the fact that we had the Clean Air Act passed in 1970 to establish standards for major air pollutants, it's not applying to this major industry that is creating a lot of these pollutants and releasing them into the air and harming humans.
Yes. And I think separate from the one you just mentioned, a specific cutout, which I came across recently, is during the Biden years, there was a methane emission reduction plan. Appropriately, the administration was recognizing the harmful effects of methane getting emitted to the environment. And the initial plan with these regulations was to enforce stricter limits on emissions of methane. Sounds like a great idea for all. However, when this bill got passed, there was one exception. There was one carve out, whereas every other industry under this bill had to comply with these rules on a mandatory basis. There was one industry for which compliance was voluntary. It was factory farms, which only had a voluntary compliance with these new methane emission standards. That's a real world cutout, and it's not to single out any one administration or party over another because this is a problem that's been going on for decades. It's a real world recent example of saying this is something that's so important to regulate methane emissions. But if you happen to be in industrial animal agriculture, this doesn't apply to you.
Yeah, and it's very on point that you mentioned that because a lot of communities have tried to push back and block new CAFOS construction and try to hold these operators accountable. But even when states try to step in, there are what are called right to farm laws. And although these laws were originally designed to protect small family farms from nuisance lawsuits, in many states, what they actually do now is shield large industrial livestock operations from adhering to local regulations or legal challenges that make it harder for these communities to hold them accountable for pollution.
It sounds like this problem is deeply ingrained in our legal system,
Yep.
in our laws, our regulations, our agencies. Does the term agency capture apply at all to any of this discussion?
I guess in what sense do you mean that?
So the EPA, like any administrative agency, has discretion over what they're going to enforce, how aggressively they're going to pursue enforcement of regulations, or whether or not they're going to put forward some new rules which improve regulation, enforce standards, or carve cutouts. How common is it that they shift what they're going to do based on trying to appease a major industry under their oversight?
So it's interesting because what I think that ties back to is what has been done to try to stop CAFOs from polluting the environment. And yet, even though there have been so many efforts to try to hold CAFOs accountable and setting new legislation in place or regulations that would monitor pollution coming from the CAFOs, the major reason they've been blocked is because, again, of how powerful the ag industry is. And if you have your hands in the pockets of the EPA or the USDA, it's easier to get them to lean on your side because ag is so huge in America that it gets that exceptionalism to allow it to have these special carve outs for them. And if you look at the laws that have attempted to change what is currently going on, for the majority of them, they've been blocked because ag wins. Ag is just too big right now, and they're able to monopolize the system, in my opinion.
So, how do we fix this and get regulations and laws that are actually on the books and getting enforced that protect the public? There needs to be some degree of accountability so that we can have cleaner air and cleaner water. I feel like we're working in a system that it's going in the wrong direction. It's not protecting the public. It's protecting a sliver of individuals and industries so that they can churn out their product, in this case, churn animals into food product as quickly and efficiently as possible. Consequences be damned. How do we turn this around?
So, if listeners care about maintaining clean water, clean air, and community health, I think there are three big things that listeners can do, which is number one, get informed. Find out if there are CAFOs near your community. Two, use your voice. You can call or write to your local state or federal representatives and demand stronger enforcement of these environmental laws to close these loopholes that are allowing CAFOs to slip through the cracks. And I think three would be to support alternatives, and that is buying from local farmers that practice sustainable agriculture. And these small steps can help shift the system away from a concentrated industrial farming industry. And by doing these three steps, we can hold these polluters accountable, protect the environment, and ensure that communities don't have to sacrifice their health for somebody else's profit.
That's all great advice. And that's some real world, simple decisions, some simple changes that you can consider making to make a difference in the system. Businesses, no matter who they are, they serve the consumer. Or now perhaps you're informed, you can now know what's going on. You can be empowered to make different decisions. And something as simple as what Daria said, seek out the small farms that don't rely on the torture and suffering induced upon animals every single day of their life. The waste management issues we talked about are going to be much, much less of an issue when you're dealing with a couple of hundred animals as opposed to 20,000 on your farm. And the product that you consume will be healthier. It will not be from an animal that spent its entire life knee deep in its own stool before it gets skinned and hacked up into pieces to go to your grocery store. It's a different life. If it's pasture raised, it's out on the pasture, not shoulder to shoulder with its other captive animals. It's a simplest like that can make a huge difference, both for you, your family, the environment, and the health of everyone involved. Those are some great points, Daria. How about what if I'm a consumer, I'm a resident, and I don't know where my meat is coming from? I don't know if my drinking water is contaminated. I'm concerned now because of this poor regulation that is clearly not protecting me as much as I thought it did. That's kind of alarming to me. How can I learn more about that in terms of where I live and the water that I'm consuming? Is it safe? And how can I take steps to make better choices to keep my family and I safe?
Yeah, that's a great question. And sadly, a lot of this does fall onto the consumer to do their own research because it's not given to us. We have to act on behalf of ourselves and seek out this information. And I think the best way that listeners should do that is by speaking to their local agencies or representatives to get those questions answered. And if anything, to ask for change or demand change because we all deserve to have clean air and clean water without an industry that gets to slip through the cracks just because it's big and powerful.
Real world options you have for making a difference for yourself, your family at the local level, and then at a bigger scale. It's because we're dealing with a systemic problem. For the longest time, we've relied on our government to help keep us safe, to help protect us. That's regardless of which side of the aisle you sit on. I think that's something that we can all agree on. That's one of the most basic roles of our government to protect the public. And you can argue about how the best way to do it is, but that's something that they're failing at, in my opinion. I think in Daria's opinion, I think of many who are in this space. There are consequences to production unregulated. There need to be guardrails in place. You wouldn't like it if your doctor was practicing unregulated. You wouldn't like it if your lawyer got their license to practice law in your state in a self regulated system. Do you think it's acceptable that your food production sites are self regulating? Is that acceptable to you? Do you trust what you see on the label? Do you trust that the product you're buying is free from bacteria, free from nitrates, free from contaminants? The air that you breathe, how much ammonia is in it? How close do you live to a farm that's putting out ammonia and hydrogen sulfide into the air? These are all important questions to ask. And once you're informed with that knowledge, then you can decide what to do with it. You can decide if you're going to take that knowledge, look further into it, talk to your friends, maybe contact your lawmaker and ask them, hey, I'm your constituent. This is not consistent with my values. This isn't the way I want to live. Ask them to represent you, to take some action to hold these industries accountable. It's your right. Very unfortunate that a lot of this relies on the consumer to seek out this information. A lot of times it's being hidden from us on purpose. That's the way it is, though. We're not going to fix that today or next year. But now that you know that your own safety in part depends on yourself, you can act now. You can look into it. A lot of this information, if not all of it, you could probably find with a few clicks on Google or whatever your preferred search engine is. You could verify it yourself. You have that knowledge, you could look even further into it. Arm yourself with better information. It's required in 2025 to make the smartest decisions that affect your own health and the health of your family.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for bringing all that up, Daria. Those are such important topics. These CAFOs have so much political power and so much money. They can suppress information. They could control the narrative to a large degree. And I'd like to think that part of what we're doing is sharing what's under the radar, what's behind the curtain, what's
Yeah,
being suppressed, perhaps on purpose, getting it out there to the public so that they can be better informed about what's really going on.
Yeah, because like you stated, doesn't matter what side of the aisle you are on, this affects all of us. And if we recall the words of, I believe it was Earl Butz, who said, get big or get out. And that was targeted at the ag industry. So if you didn't want to become industrialized and huge, you weren't going to make it as a small farmer. So we need to protect our small farms and advocate against these bigger farms that are breaking all these laws and impacting our health.
Absolutely. All right, Daria, this has been such a great discussion. I hope we've enlightened a bit, shed some new ideas, perhaps challenged some of the dominant narratives out there, and given you some ideas for ways you can explore more and learn from what we've talked about, make some better decisions going forward. Daria, any closing comments? Anything else you'd like to share? Points you want to drive home? Calls to action?
I think what I'll leave with is you're your own best advocate. So do your research and make your voice heard if you don't agree with what's going on around us. You are able to use your voice to protect yourself and your family. And the more people we have, there's power in numbers. Let's make ourselves educated and follow the choices that we believe in.
That's a great conclusion. In 2025, I think staying informed is also required. Verify your information, look things up on your own, verify for yourself, make sure you have the accurate information to make the most informed decisions on what matters to you. If you liked this episode, please click like, follow, subscribe, share with a friend. Daria, again, thank you so much for being on here. I really appreciate your time and your insights on these matters, which affect everybody in the country. Thanks, Daria.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. These conversations aren't always easy, but they're important and worth having. Take what resonates, ask questions, and keep learning. Find us on Doctor Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice nor legal advice, and it cannot replace professional consultation with your doctor, lawyer, or other licensed expert. Always seek guidance that's specific to your situation.